table for all your thoughts and non-prayers. And welcome back to another episode of The Nonprofits. This show is a product of the ACA, a 501c3 nonprofit organization dedicated to the separation of religion and government and promoting positive atheism. Watch our newest episode premiere at 3 p.m. Central on the Nonprofits YouTube channel. All right, this show is awesome because we have the first ever all-female show. So let's start off with some introductions. Let's start over on my left with Shannon Q.
Hi, I'm Shannon Q.
So Shannon, tell us a little bit about yourself.
My name is Shannon Q. I have a YouTube channel called Shannon Q. I am one of the hosts of the Atheist Experience here on the ACA series of channels that you can subscribe to. This is hopefully one that you're subscribed to. Also, if you aren't, you should do it right now. And I'm also on a bunch of other YouTube channels from time to time. Apologia, Professor Stick, Vice Rhino, Godless Engineer. Oh my gosh, like the list goes on. I'm probably forgetting a bunch of them, but yeah, so like you'll see me around. I have a degree in psychology and I talk about the intersection of psychology and faith quite a bit, and I engage in complex conversations on my channels, and I am very, very, very amped to be here tonight. So thank you for having me.
Absolutely. I'm super excited too. I can't wait to see what we all talk about, especially in terms of what you bring to the table. So next, let's move even further to the left, which is Cynthia. Oh, Cynthia, you're muted.
That's what happens when you keep on pressing buttons. You don't know what the hell you're doing. Hey guys, I'm Cynthia. I know. I'm so sorry, y'all. Sorry. Hi, I'm Cynthia. I'm a regular here on the Nonprofits. I also guest on a bunch of different streams as well. Sometimes I am on, I premiered a lot on the Why Your Friendly Neighborhood Atheist. I also host of my own socio-political show called The 13%, which is going to be re-premiering on community-focused news media. I also do another YouTube show called The Chronicles of a Revolutionary Nerd, which we talk about comics and pop culture and movies and all the different stuff from a blurred perspective. And I am, but by trade, I am a social worker, specifically in HIV medical case manager here in the city of Wind. And I'm so excited to be here to be making history.
I love it. We're going to have so much fun. All right, over to the last but not least, the beautiful Arden of Eden.
Hey everyone, I'm Arden. I go by Arden of Eden. I am currently doing a thing where I co-host over on The Line, a show called The Transatlantic Call-In Show with my friend Katie. We take calls about trans rights and all that good stuff. We've had a few spicy calls in the past few weeks, so that's always fun. And then I do my own thing over on Twitch with the regular hero Puck, and just kind of doing art, playing games, hanging out, being a normal person, not making everything in my life about atheism, even though it all is kind of about atheism. Yeah. Also excited to be here.
Oh, awesome. And really quickly, I'm Laura. I do Unapologetically Me, and I just started a new podcast called The Skeptic Hangout. I'm not quite as all over the place as Shannon Q, but I've done the perspective, nonprofits. I did, I can't remember the name of the show I did the other week because it's brand spanking new, but I will make sure it gets into the show notes below. So that is our crew for today. And before we get started, I have just a little bit of business. So sit back and relax, and we'll get started. First, I wanted to start with some ways that you can help out with the ACA. The first and easiest way, as Shannon said so beautifully, is to subscribe and to like our channel. I also highly recommend that you put the notification bell to on so that you're always notified when we have a new show premiering. But guys, dude, get this. We just made 8,000 subscribers. And once we hit 10,000 subscribers, we can start doing fundraisers for the ACA. So if you haven't subscribed yet, you can help us out by doing that right now. Please also share with your friends, family members, coworkers, that neighbor guy that you don't really like anyone and everyone. Let's just get the word out there so that we can get to that 10,000 subscriber mark and start having fundraisers. After you're done doing that, there are lots of other ways that you can contribute. You can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/thenonprofits. And if you're already shopping at Amazon, you can support the ACA by shopping at smile.amazon.com and selecting the Atheist Community of Austin as the beneficiary. A really cool way that you can get involved is to check out the new Atheist Experience Network on YouTube. It's a one-stop shop for all the ACA shows in a podcast form, all in one channel. So you can subscribe at tiny.cc/AEN podcasts, and you can listen to all the episodes of Nonprofits, Atheist Experience, and all the other shows. That way, you don't miss a single episode. Also, if you want to continue to get in touch with other fans and the hosts, you can feel free to join us on our fan-run social media outlets. So you can find most of the nonprofit hosts hanging out on the Atheist Community of Discord, which is tiny.cc/ACA Discord. You can also find us on Facebook at facebook.com/groups/nonprofitslive. The cool thing about the Discord and Facebook places is they're both created by fans for fans. So when you go there, you know that you're in really good company. We also value your feedback. So tell us what you like, tell us what you don't like in the comment section below, or you can email us at nonprofits@atheist-community.org. Okay, last but not least, before we get started, as with all of our shows, the links to the topics that we're discussing and all the news articles are available in the description below. So feel free to pause this video and read the material for yourself. Please, I beg you, don't just take our word for it. But do make sure that you come back and that you hear our discussion. All right, so.
You're really excited.
There's articles to check on. Okay, so that sums up all of our business. So let's go ahead and start off with Shannon Q introducing our first article.
Oh, awesome. I'm really excited. I can't stress enough how much I love getting people to advocate for their own understanding and actually reading the sources for themselves. So every time I hear that, I get viscerally, like involuntarily excited. So first, we're going to talk about Beth Moore. If you don't know who Beth Moore is, she was a pretty popular preacher, apologist, still is. She has a huge following on Twitter. I follow her myself, actually. And she is now, and I saw this on Twitter and was excited about it, apologizing for her teachings on women after leaving the evangelical church. So before I word vomit all over everybody, what did you guys think? Who wants to go first? I'll call on people. We mom up.
Well, I guess I can go ahead and go. So just reading this article, I'm not very familiar with Beth Moore. To be honest with you all, I kind of like, I used to follow like a lot of preachers when I was a Christian, right?
Right.
And now that's not my lane, because obviously I'm here. I kind of found like especially like some evangelical rhetoric, tele-evangelical rhetoric, very problematic, and it just doesn't sit well with my spirit. I'm sorry, it just doesn't. So, so oftentimes, like, I don't necessarily like follow a lot of them. However, I do try to dip my toe in a little once in a while to kind of get like, some of the things that they're saying, so we know what is that they're saying, and even to come up with like, rebuttal if necessary. So with that being said, when reading this, I was glad that she realized that, a lot of the things that she was saying specifically about, gender roles was problematic. I'm going to butcher this word because it's long and it's a $5 word and I don't have $5. Complementarianism.
Complementarianism.
Yes.
Yes. Hooked on phonics worked for me.
That is a monster of a word, though.
It is. It is. I was just like, whoa, okay. And I said, I'm going to try to actually say this word on a nonprofit show. And I know I'm going to butcher it, but I'm going to do it anyway because I'm not a quitter.
You butchered it beautifully, though. You did it with grace.
Executed perfectly, yes.
Thank you very much. So, so this is even looking up exactly what it was. It's like, that's that theology that, holds this whole thing about God creating men and women equal in their own, like, essential dignity and human personhood, but they have this different complementary functions in their particular roles, right? But the thing about it is that, and even the Supreme Court agreed with this, is that separate is not always equal. And the thing about it is, and one of the things that kind of surprised me a little bit is that she came to this particular realization and still kind of holds on to her beliefs, because the Bible supports complementarianism.
Yes.
Yeah, that was one of the things that I found as well.
Yeah. It supports it. I mean, like, you look at even though, like, oftentimes the Bible verse, the go-to, that Christians apologists happen to go, it's like, whoa, they're equal because, in Galatians 3:20, what's it, 3:28, that there's neither Greek nor Jew, there's neither slave nor free, there's no male nor female, we are all one in Jesus Christ, right? But you get Paul at 1 Timothy that talks about, not permitting women to teach or exercise authority over a man. And then also you have even in Ephesians 5:22 about wives being submissive to your husbands and say that Jesus wants this, like Christ wants this. So it seems to me that that particular view as far as like gender roles and having being very distinct, in this like evangelical worldview ideology is something that would be espouse, preach, and I know I've heard it, as far as like being in church is concerned, and not a whole lot of like liberation when it came to gender roles, but at the same time, we also know that cherry picking is also a thing, right?
That was my thing. It was like, what's your line? Like, that's your line. And it seems like that's your line because you realize that affects you. So you're able to go through a reinterpretation process where simultaneously without acknowledging that it requires interpretation, and that makes it essentially subjective because your original interpretation you held to, obviously you had reasons to hold to that interpretation. You preached it until you hit a wall where it somehow affected you, or you saw the effect on others. I'm not sure which one, but then you realized, oh crap, and started to change your interpretation so that your view of the scripture could align with your moral integrity. So you've recognized that there's a wall and that you're willing to adapt in order to hit that wall. But if you're willing to do that in one area, shouldn't you be willing to do that in all areas? And shouldn't you recognize that you're making these subjective interpretations just to suit yourself? That's where I find it hard. Like, I'm glad she's doing this because I agree with her, right? Because I think it's a good thing to not enforce biblical gender roles. But there's probably biblical interpretations that she still has that I very much disagree with. And I find it difficult to have overall respect for somebody's perspective when they hit a wall and are willing to make a change. Like, it's brave, I suppose, to go up against like this huge misogynistic institution. That's a difficult thing to do. I have to give her respect for that. But also, how do you do that and simultaneously not recognize that, like you said, Cynthia, there is textual support for this? And is there textual support for other things that maybe you're like, oh shit?
So there is quite a bit of cognitive dissonance there, in the sense that there's a recognition that one belief is wrong. But you're right. That recognition that, oh, I was wrong all along about this, did not in any way shake her faith in what she believes about everything else. And one of the quotes that I found interesting was, she said, I trusted that the motives were godly. I have not lost my mind, nor my doctrine, just my naivety. And what bothers me about that, kind of going along with what you ladies were saying, is the same thing, where it's like, you interpreted the scripture one way, and now you're reinterpreting the scripture another way. Doesn't that kind of make us all like our own gods in a certain way, right? If we can all just interpret the scripture however we want to, at what point can we determine, yes, this is God?
Yeah, you recognize a previous naivety. So why don't you acknowledge the fact that you could currently be just as naive, but also simultaneously just as convinced?
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think I found it interesting at one point she was saying how, the complementarianism is taken as like a first tier doctrine. And I think that's such like a funny like way of phrasing it, because I'm like, how do you determine what is the first tier and what's like the lower tier? Like, are the things God commands that he only kind of meant? And like, where is that line? Like,
This is only sort of a rule or a guideline.
Right.
Like the shrimp one he's in on.
Fabrics mixing
The one
fabrics.
about shutting the fuck up and not trying to teach anybody anything in
Right.
church. He was pretty serious about that one.
Right.
So have any of you before this heard of tier 1 teaching versus other tiers? Because that was the first I'd ever heard of it.
As far as terminology, yes, but in practice, no. Because like I remember specifically when I was studying to be a minister, and I was very much so the inquisitive one out of our class, and some of my questions in some cases was problematic to my instructor, and reason being is because like when I would ask questions about, certain things that we would read in the Bible that's problematic, but we have to teach anyway and just take it for, charge it to the game or whatever, it was always like, oh, well, that's left to interpretation, or, no, that you got to take that out of context, or, it's up to interpretation, and depending on the doctrine that your denomination or non-denomination actually espouses would determine how you would interpret said scripture when it's being taught to congregant members. So like I can so like when the article actually mentioned this, the first tier, portion when it comes to like, biblical interpretation, like it made sense only because like I was because I've seen it in practice, if that makes sense.
It does, yeah. Yeah. So going back to something that you said when you talked about how do you determine the truth? One thing that I notice is when people say something like filled with the Holy Spirit, right? The Holy Spirit will guide us, or the Holy Spirit will tell us which interpretation is correct. And that one always kind of got me, because you have multiple people saying the Holy Spirit are leading them to multiple different conclusions. Right? Yeah.
I have everything to say about it, because this frustrated me so much when I was questioning. That was one of the things that frustrated me so much, because if I had questions about interpretation and stuff, they would say both simultaneously, God and the Holy Spirit will guide you towards understanding the correct interpretation. And also, if you don't, that's because you have free will. And that means that you are fallen in the spirit, because we are all lost and broken due to sin. And therefore, that means that you got the correct interpretation. And I was like, well, which is it? Am I capable of figuring this out because God's going to guide me? Or is God definitely not going to guide me because I have free will, so he doesn't do that sort of shit? Like, which one is it? Like, figure it out. Like you're setting me up for failure. Either I'm going to interpret it and think it's right and maybe be really, really wrong, and then I have to pay the consequences for that, or I'm going to interpret it right and maybe think I'm wrong, but that's because of my free will.
Or even worse, okay, so what always got me about exactly that was, if you are led down the wrong path because of your own free will, is that because God chose not to explain to you correctly and chose not to inspire you, or chose not to reveal to you? Like, am I chosen to not understand? Like, it always kind of bothered me that we can choose to go to heaven, but if God chooses not to inspire us, how does that work?
There's always an escape hatch.
Yeah.
Every time. To get out of it not making any goddamn sense.
I think
none of it makes sense.
I also kind of wanted to build off of what you were saying earlier, Shannon, with like, how you agreeing with the direction she's going, because it's like it's definitely more ideal to, not be complementarian than to be complementarian. But I feel like this is something, especially from the atheist perspective, that can be super, super frustrating with like understanding that, we're never going to probably reach a society where there is no Christianity. And this is something I've been struggling on the past few episodes I've been on the nonprofits, like expressing of like trying to find that room where like it's exciting and even like, inspiring in some way that a lot of Christians are moving in this direction of like a more acceptable kind of form of Christianity that works with the society that we live in. But it's still so frustrating when, you know, Cynthia, you have out like what was like 2 or 3 verses just there of proving how like being complementarian is actually probably the more biblical position to have. So like,
absolutely.
Yeah, I really struggle with learning how to I don't know, make room for those people to go in the direction that seems best for them and for all of us, but also to like hold them accountable for like, but how can you say you're not letting go of your doctrine when you clearly are? It's such a conflicted feeling.
That's such a good point.
That's an excellent point. And I think that even like, and I keep on going back to experience because that's all I really have to hold on to when it comes to, you know, conversations like this. That oftentimes when you find you know, different doctrines that are in the Bible that's constantly like, you know, preached at you, right? Specifically, you know, when we're talking about gender roles, right? And even though that Beth have came to this particular realization that this is problematic, this is not correct, this is not what we should be teaching. I was naive when I did it, but you know, when I stated before that, you know, the Bible supports this, but you had to kind of reckon with your own beliefs in this particular area, and I'm curious to know if this would kind of be a catalyst to make her reckon with a lot of other beliefs that she might be holding on to that are also problematic. And I think that, and going back to my personal experience, I know for myself that I kind of had to, you know, challenge what I believed, if that makes sense, because like now it's in front of me, it's in my face, and I had to use some type of like reasoning to see like if my beliefs were even logical or not, you know. And I think that possibly this is something that she's dealing with right now with this specifically. So maybe in the future, because of this will also open up a door for her to challenge something else and may even get her to deconvert, possibly.
Yeah.
See, I think that there's a lot to that. Like when you talk about my own deconversion, it was the same way. It was having those questions in the first place that didn't have satisfying answers. And Shannon Q, from what you were saying earlier, it was kind of the same thing where it's like, the answer that you gave me didn't quite work, and so I eventually worked my way out of it.
Yeah.
But I also know of a lot of Christians that are just sort of atypical Christians, where they're like, well, I take this bit and I take that bit, and God is right, but we recognize that the Bible is the word of man and it's sort of flawed, but God's in there. So they kind of have these really
cafeteria Christians.
like a really twisted way of making it all fit, and then they're just happy there forever. There's no challenge. There's no, I'm going to continue to press my beliefs, you know. So I think it happens kind of both ways. But going back to something Arden had said about why that this happens, right? Like it's so doctrinal, and yet these people that follow different religions, not just Christianity, but any religion, they'll change over time. And one thing I wanted to kind of bring up just for everyone's consideration, so I have a degree in cultural anthropology, and my big passion is culture versus religion versus history versus everything, like how it all intertwines. And there is no clear separation between culture and religion. Like they're just so well intertwined. So when you have a cultural movement and those people want that religion to survive, it morphs into the culture. And then it also does the opposite, where when a religion is brought into a culture, the culture itself changes. So I think that's what we're seeing here is there's a powerful culture shift away from misogyny and male dominance into more equality and looser gender roles and stuff like that. And religion, it's like do or die. It's like adapt or you're done. You know?
And it's almost like the people who happen to be a practitioner of this religion are the ones that's making that shift, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. And you know what? You said something very, very poignant, especially when you talked about how like there's not that much separation when it comes to religion and culture. And I totally can can attest to that. You know, I even think about like how important, you know, Christianity is even in the African American community. It's like there's like there's hardly any separation. It's like, you know, if you ain't black, if you ain't Christian, you know, and even like how its practice, or even when it comes to like things like music, or even like style of preaching, or even when it comes to style of dress when you are actually worshiping on Sundays, is also very much so engraved in culture. So yeah, that makes so much sense. Thank you for bringing that up, Laura.
Yeah, thank you. So, do we have any final thoughts on this article before we move on to the next one?
That actually segues really well into the next one.
Exactly. But I want to make sure we captured any thoughts before I moved on.
No,
Okay.
I think I've one quick thing.
Yeah.
I'm really think the thing that Arden brought up about struggling between the culture is moving in the right direction despite of religion, and people who are religious moving in the right direction with culture despite of religion, and also this really stark emotional recognition that it is in fact despite of the religion, and because they had a previous interpretation they could have a different one. So you want to support them moving in the right direction, but simultaneously go, you understand that that's because like you're going against everything, like
you do get it,
but you
right?
don't want to do that because
contradicting.
you don't want to be like, hey, you're wrong about all that, your book says this, and them go, yeah, you're right, it does, maybe I'll change my mind, you know what, screw women, go back to the kitchen. Like it's a
Back to
really
slavery.
Yeah.
Back to-
Yeah,
Right.
exactly. So you know, and that's a good point too, because like you want to celebrate, right? You know, your epiphany. As far as like yeah, you get it, but don't you know?
almost right there.
Oh my God. But those opportunities make it easier for the different demographics, like between atheist and religious, to work together, and then
I
that
agree.
chips away more at the religious doctrine. So I think it kind of flows a cycle that kind of keeps it moving in the right direction.
I agree with that, but man, it's hard sometimes.
Ah, I agree. Yeah.
I'll just go, but did you see what this says?
All right, so perfect time to move on to Article 2. And Shannon, you were going to introduce Article 2 too. This is something you're really passionate about.
I will. I'll try not to railroad this whole thing. So this article is from Psychology Today, and it was just posted on April 11th, and it's called "Who Hears the Voice of God?" And it's about the cultural context, which is why I think this is a good segue regarding an individual's personality predicting them of having or like self-reporting spiritual experiences. Now, I didn't read a lot of the Psychology Today article. What I did was I went and read the study and all of the appendices that are attached to, because I'm a big fan of source methodology. So it's especially when it comes to psychology. So when I see a Psychology Today article, and I have a degree in psychology, right? So I wanted to see the article. So I went right to the article and read the article. And I'm going to give just like a brief summary, and then I'll ask you what you guys think. And then I can kind of go into some of the critiques I have regarding their methodology as I see it. Essentially what this article did was it did 4 different studies across cultures. So it went in 4 different countries. I can't remember. I think it was like Ghana, the United States, China. There's one other that I'm not remembering off the top of my head, but they went to, so they thought that they could get kind of like a broad range of people who had different spiritual backgrounds, but were largely spiritual. And they were going to measure them on 2 different metrics. One of those metrics was what they call porosity. And porosity is how much culture or the society that you're in, or just your general personality, but likely from their hypothesis, they thought it was more so going to be culturally based, would indicate that you perceive your mind as a part of your overall environment, and that you incorporate perceptions of the environment into how you interpret reality. And then the second, I'm going to forget it off the top of my head.
Absorption.
Thank you, Arden. Oh my gosh, I love you. Yeah. The second was absorption, and absorption is what they saw more so as a personality trait. So they measured it on 2 different metrics, and they had this hypothesis that based on how much your religious culture, I guess you would call it, because you can't just call it culture, because they kind of grouped people based on spiritualities for the most part, that how entrenched your religious culture was going to be an indicator of whether or not you interpreted perceptual ambiguities as a religious experience. And they found that in fact, that was the case. Like, big surprise, they supported their hypothesis in this study, and they found that the more religiosity you essentially had, the higher the chance was that you were going to experience this sort of spiritual experience and interpret it as such. So that's what the study says. Before I poo on everyone's parade, what did you guys think of it?
Go ahead. You first, Cynthia.
Oh, no, I was just going to tell you that it was four studies with more than 2,000 participants in the United States, Ghana, Thailand, China, and Vanuatu?
Right. I forgot those two.
Yeah, Vanuatu, which... Does anybody know where Vanuatu is? I suck at geography. If it wasn't for GPS, I would get nowhere.
You're gonna get ripped apart in the comments, all of us now.
Google it now. I knew the whole time. I just wanted you guys to feel better.
I opened that door. I totally opened that door. So I would take that L. How about that? So okay, so some of my thoughts when I was reading this particular article, even though I find psychology a very interesting topic, and I still go back to experience. So the whole porosity versus absorption determining factors of if a person was more likely to claim that they hear from God. And thank you for letting us know that it is 700 miles off of the east coast of Australia. Vanuatu. Vanuatu is 700 miles off of the coast of Australia, east. Great. Not west.
You've at least learned that.
But east.
Yeah.
East. Oceania, yep.
Right. Thank you, producers crew. We would be nothing without you. I want you to know that from my heart to your ears. So, going back to, the subject matter is porosity versus absorption, determining factors of, they're more likely to hear from God. Again, I kept on going back to my own experiences as a practitioner of theism. Especially, of course, I was a Christian, right? And, and oftentimes, I would still think about my own personal cultural experience to even figure out if I was possibly hearing from God. Oftentimes, especially in worship services, and I'm pretty sure that a lot of people can attest to this, especially if they come from a more charismatic background. Music playing in certain ways, the people who were in the midst of even speaking in tongues. I know that is actually, there's a proper terminology for speaking in tongues. Yes, that, Shannon Q, that. Yeah. So, and all those particular things, oftentimes I could remember specifically, times in those particular experiences, like worship experiences, that I thought that I was hearing from God. And oftentimes that would even follow up with this whole thing. And I believe that the article also brought up, people who have a tendency. No, that's the other article about intuition. Sorry.
We'll get there.
Going back. We're going to get there.
There's an overlap. Yeah.
There's an overlap, people. There's an overlap. But, but even in that particular, experience, those cultural indications, especially in those environments, I feel are more so like the things that would set the stage in order for you to feel that you're hearing something or you're having some type of a spiritual experience when I would conjecture it's like either you're just hearing from yourself or you probably hearing your other neighbors saying something and you thinking that is God, but that's really Ned the wino, but that's I'm just being silly.
You mentioned the whole the feelings and the music and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And how, so I just put a video on my watch list for later, and I haven't seen it yet, but it's on emotional priming, and that is big.
That's Drew's video, isn't it?
I think so. Yeah. So I haven't watched it yet. I should have before this show because it would have been perfect to talk about. But I know enough about it to say that is really big, both in cultural traditional practices to kind of get people into a spun up to feel a certain way about certain things. But it's huge in religion. And so when you talk about that emotional priming, the music and the way that preachers preach their message with tones of voices and word choices and stuff like that, that is psychologically designed to make us feel and react a certain way.
Oh, you know what? And I didn't mean to cut you off, but
No,
I
you're
I
good.
can even remember, like, studying to be a minister. Like, we had a whole section about, the service itself, and
Mhm.
how the service would intertwine with, what music is being played and how it's being played. Also,
The lighting.
yeah, the lighting, the tone of voice, they and I remember, like, they would oftentimes would talk about don't perform, yet and still they would also bring in the whole, and I'm just saying they because I don't want to use anybody's names or anything like that, but they would still talk about how, all these things that are going on is in art, and I was like, well, performance art.
That's exactly what it is.
Yeah, and to your point about this, like, emotional priming, that's exactly what it is. In order to make sure as much as possible that, people are having this particular experience with it, they're feeling that they are in the presence of God. Oftentimes it was said to us, like, you have to prepare the environment in order for you to hear from God.
Not just the environment, but your mind. Sorry, someone was starting to talk.
No, it's okay. I'm waiting for Arden to have the opportunity to talk because I have
I
700 things to
have
say.
a tiny little thing to add, because my thing is mostly about the things that I felt unsatisfied with from the information within the article that I assume will be resolved from hearing more about the studies that they were sourcing. Because I felt like the measures of porosity and absorption were, like, at least as they were described in the article, were, like, super nebulous and, like, sure, in, like, certain contexts they sound like they could apply to someone's experience of spirituality. But yeah, there was just, like, a few problems, like the porosity being described as a mind experienced as separate from the self is less open to influence. I don't know. There was a whole bunch of things that were, like, just not lighting up for me, but I think it was mostly because I felt like this article is kind of obfuscating some of the points that may be made in the study. So I'm excited to hear what Shannon has to say.
Okay, so I have a bunch of things to say about this study.
Take us there.
Yes, go for it.
So first, I want to start with what's good about this study. What the study, I think, recognizes that's really important to recognize, and I think that is supported through multidisciplinary approaches, is that there is a cultural basis for perceptual recognition of, like, of how you interpret experiences. And the study does do a moderately okay job. You can tell that they're kind of burying the lead a bit because they're not explicit in terms when they say, like, the secular West in the society. That's how they described some of the readers from the secular West. I was like, yeah, it's a bit of a flag to me. Because that's not necessary.
Like, what does that mean?
Yeah, what does that mean? Right. So but they did do a decent job of acknowledging, and I would agree with them, that couching in cultural context does in fact have an effect on the likelihood that you are going to interpret some sort of perceptual experience as a spiritual one. Like, that's just a fact. But they buried their appendix. And I went, like, you can follow the links and find it. And I found it because one of the things that I'm interested about is that all 4 studies were actually self-report. They did have a bit of what I would call maybe a sampling bias, specifically in the 4th one, because it was all undergraduate students that they selected because they were more familiar with the style of survey, which you shouldn't need to be familiar with the style of survey. That's giving yourself a sampling bias and acknowledging it. But even in study 1, so here's the thing that they didn't reference in study 1. In study 1, they said that they were using, like, a diverse approach to finding people. They didn't really talk about the type of questions they were asking people. And that's what's interesting to me. Like, I don't care what you thought about the questions that you asked the people. I want to know what the questions you asked the people are. And we were all talking about priming. And here's one of the really important things that they did. In study 1, they opened the conversations with these people who they recruited at churches and institutions of faith. They opened the conversation with them by saying, we first began to question about the participants' religious practice with a very particular focus on prayer and prayer-like practices like meditation. These questions were not analyzed at all in the current paper. Now, what you do when you do something like that is you put somebody in a contemplative state where you're saying, okay, do some sort of introspection regarding your relationship to faith. when you're asking somebody to do some sort of introspection regarding their relationship to faith, and then you ask them a series of questions afterwards about experiences they had and whether or not they relate to their faith, you've primed them to say that they are, especially when you don't intersperse questions that are control questions. And from what I can tell, they do not have any control questions. It's not as though they went into a study and they said, hey, have you ever had this experience? Have you ever had that experience? And some of them were innocuous. There are examples of innocuous questions where, have you ever seen a specter? A specter could be interpreted as a spiritual experience, for example, right? But they didn't tether it specifically to a religion. So the way that they did their questions was actually geared towards eliciting people talking about, because there were probative questions that they were doing as well. Like they would ask somebody about a spiritual experience, and then they would ask things about, they used a phenomenological approach. So they would ask how did that feel? Where did you feel that? At what did you hear it with your ears? Did you hear it in your head? They were looking to like deeply get the person to explain this as if it was a real experience to them. Like it was predicated on the assumption it was a real experience and primed on that experience being religious and then being introspective. I have more to say about memory construction. I don't know if you guys are interested about memory construction and priming and how it relates.
Oh,
like
yeah.
Well, so I was actually going to comment on that, because they've done studies that talk about, say, just people at a crime scene, for example. They'll set up fake crime scenes and they'll have the people watch and they'll ask them questions afterwards. And they found that if you prime the person, like if you hear somebody else say the guy had a red shirt, the person's more likely to say, oh yeah, the guy had a red shirt, even if the guy's shirt was yellow. Right. And I remember it clearly. And so they've shown that memories can be falsified, and they've shown that memories can be altered, or that they can be made to be bigger or lesser experiences based on the questions that they ask or the environment that they're in, whether or not they hear other people give information or not. So that was one thing that I found really interesting is, yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, like, just from your debrief, Shannon, it almost sounds like that the way that they actually formulated their questions was to come to their already hypothetical conclusion. And matter of fact, I even stated, like, there was like one quote that I found in the article that says, but there are also numerous details of specific beliefs, practices, and experiences. Both are important, and they are best studied together. And I felt like that was kind of like, like, I guess, wait and we'll see. It seemed like a very subjective statement to me, only because, like, you acknowledge that they are important. I don't know. We still need to study, but I don't. But it even almost sounds like that, and especially since you mentioned, the lack thereof of control questions to actually come up with I would say like a broader spectrum. So that we can get just like more details about how people are thinking or feeling or what have you when they're having these particular experiences. It seems almost like the study can be a bit, like you mentioned, like biased only to their particular hypotheses.
They picked spiritual people, put them in a state of spiritual awareness, and then asked them if they had spiritual experiences. And then they did. What? Like, could you imagine?
Was really...
Laura, what you're talking about is actually Elizabeth Loftus' work. She does really, really good work on memory reconstruction. Like, one of the things that, like, I just want to talk super quickly about memory reconstruction because I think it's important, and then I will shut up, I promise. But one of the things that they did was they asked a lot of leading and sort of like introspective questions. And the leading and introspective questions, especially when you're primed to be in a different state, can actually kind of reconstruct memories for you. One of the things that's interesting, like, it's not even as stark as red shirt, blue shirt. That's more conformity. If I showed you a car crash, for example, like I showed you, two of you a car crash, and both of you watched the exact same car crash and you were sequestered in different rooms. This is Elizabeth's work as well. And I said to you, Cynthia, how fast was that car going when it bumped into the other car? And Laura, to you, I said, how fast was that car going when it smashed into the other car? Based on my vocal inflection and the language that I use, you are going to give me two different determinations of speed despite having the same perceptual experience. That's because the language that I was using to cause you to recall that memory is actively constructing that memory at the point of recall. because memories aren't just something you can go into a filing cabinet and pull out. They're reconstructed as we recall them. So the priming that I use in order to elicit that memory from you affects your interpretation of that memory in real time. And that's the type of thing that was happening here. You're putting somebody in a spiritual state and you're asking them if they had a spiritual experience and then asking them to delve in more in an environment where they have an observer bias, where they could have a complicity bias because they want to please somebody. You've recruited them specifically from a church. Like, there are so many confounding variables related to the outcome of the, and they have no controls in place whatsoever. They just interviewed spiritual people after putting them in a spiritual state about spiritual experiences using priming questions and went, can you believe we found this? Yeah, fucking everyone can.
Well, what I thought was really interesting about it was that they even said that atheists and non-spiritual people had quote unquote spiritual experiences. What that tells me is we're having an experience, like an experience is happening, and the researchers or whoever's concluding this says that this experience is spiritual. So rather than, hey, there's this psychological experience, we don't know much about it, we're going to explore it, they're already saying, oh, this experience is a spiritual experience versus this is happening, X, Y, and Z is happening in the brain, right?
Right.
So me, I have amazing experiences when I listen to certain music or when I dance or do certain things. And that's what they would call a spiritual experience, right? I would label it as something else. So I think that there was a little bit of a, like what Shannon said, like a huge bias just in the labeling of the experience alone.
Yeah,
Right.
I don't particularly care for, even though like I was making my whole jokes about like, you know, in my spirit. But the thing about it,
that's it, all in jest.
yeah, of course. But I don't like it oftentimes when like this word of spiritual or spirituality is oftentimes just thrown around willy-nilly without a qualifier. I mean, like, because like even when I read that, Laura, I was just like, that's just a claim. What is spiritual?
Yeah.
Can it be quantified? Well, like according to our study, I say yeah, but like, you know, Shannon just pointed out, like your study was biased and you don't have any you didn't have any control questions. So you know, this whole thing is completely subjective to, you know, how you framed it.
Yeah. I think the only last thing I want to add on to this was I think it's really interesting that the article that kind of spurred all of this research that Shannon has done for us concluded by saying that the benefits are clear. Mind you, there's no information following what these benefits are. But Shannon, correct me if I'm wrong. The only information that can be drawn from this research is that people from certain contexts who have certain qualities to their person might have spiritual experiences. The study says nothing about benefits of such experiences.
No, you're yes. And even that's tenuous. Really, to be honest, because of the methodology that they utilize. Like, anytime that you see a study that's only 6 pages, that is like, especially if it's a study that's like a meta-analysis that incorporates multiple studies, and especially if every single one of those studies, all 4 of them that were conducted, were interview analyses, and they do not explain at all, really, aside from saying we use a diverse phenomenological approach to our question that was very clinical. If they don't explain it at all, why they chose what questions and where they were at like, this is why people look at psychology. Like, this is why I wanted to look into it, because I love psychology, right? Like, I studied psychology. Like, that's my jam. So when I look at studies like this, I'm like, oh, now I see why people call us pseudoscience, because you're like, people had feelings and we wrote them down. Yeah, you did. Thank you. Thank you.
Great, problem solved.
Right.
Yeah.
Wait, hold on. Wait, I'm sorry. I can't get over this. Wait, you okay. Four different countries and over 2,000 participants, and it only came down to 6 pages.
Yes, that's what freaking infuriated me. I was like, I'm gonna read every single goddamn appendix, because if you guys bury them, there's a reason. You guys want people to see the high level. Like, this article was essentially like, the study was more abstract to me. It was just like a 6-page long abstract. It was clickbait.
So what I got out of it was that we have experiences. That's literally all I got out of it, was that we have experiences.
And they're influenced by culture.
Yeah. Oh yeah. And that they're influenced by culture.
And none of us knew that before today, so thank God.
Sweet. All right. Do we have any other final thoughts before we move on from this article?
No, I think I've done enough.
Throwing in the towel, Shannon. We're good. Okay, I'm gonna hand it over to Arden then, and she's gonna introduce Article 3 on the Dunning-Kruger Effect.
Okay, so yes, Article 3 was called the Dunning-Kruger Effect, ignorance and overconfidence, affect intuitive thinking, new study says, and that's from the debrief. So this study was essentially kind of elaborating on a study from the Frontiers in Psychology journal that I believe they developed, I should probably clarify, they were analyzing like a measure of intuitive response thinking based on a test called the Cognitive Response Test, I think, CRT. And what they found was that the questions are all meant to be kind of like misleading. Like when you read them quickly and you're meant to answer them, like you're kind of meant to get like an easy answer, but there's actually like a more clearer answer. And it's meant to test like how good your intuitive reasoning skills are. And they found that people who scored the lowest on this cognitive reflection test are the ones who overestimated their score the most. So this is something that's just kind of confirming something we've known for a long time called the Dunning-Kruger Effect, where people who are really low on a measure of expertise in a topic tend to also measure very highly on their confidence in the topic. And basically, this article was just meant to talk about how important that this study demonstrates like our intuitive reasoning skills are, and how like, especially in an era of like misinformation where like headlines are, explicitly trying to get you to confirm a bias just from reading a headline, having really well developed intuitive reasoning skills is like incredibly important. So I don't know what y'all thought about this one.
Oh my goodness. You know what? I feel so bad because I didn't even know that there was such thing as a Dunning-Kruger effect until I actually became atheist.
Oh, and isn't that crazy? I didn't either.
That checks out.
I learned a lot of shit when I became atheist.
All of us did.
Interesting how that happens, isn't it?
Right. Even like it was kind of interesting to actually learn about like the whole notion about the Dunning-Kruger effect actually came out in like I believe in 1999. Oh, and that was like one of the years that I was actually in college. So I'll just chop it up to that. That's the reason why I didn't know that it wasn't out when I was in school. So there you go. I blamed the education system. How dare you?
Time's fault also. Time.
Yes. Yeah. And time. Yes. And time. No TARDIS pun intended, But I pulled out a couple of quotes that I just wanted to, share and kind of get you guys' takes on it from the article. I found this one interesting when the point of exploring the subject of intuition specifically, when the article says that a wealth of research has demonstrated that intuition is a powerful and scientifically backed skill that can help people make faster and more accurate decisions. However, it goes on to say, and this is specifically from one of the co-authors, I believe Dr. Couchman, stated that people who consider themselves to be more intuitive probably notice and remember the times that their intuition worked and forgot when it was incorrect. And the results in a deficit in knowledge, but also boost their confidence in the incorrect process. Both of those problems work together to make it more likely they will make errors in the future. And a couple things was brought out, to me concerning this. One, I got scared that I, may be guilty of maybe using an intuition skill a bit too much, and it's kind of like, where do you draw the line in, and because intuition oftentimes is sharpened by experience, right? If I've been through this thing before, I kind of know what to do and what not to do because I'm used to it. But at the same time, you start to, when you become more privy to these particular notions, then you get kind of concerned that, well, even though that this whole skill set is part of me? What if the whole time that I've been developing it, I've been wrong? So I guess like to me, like this kind of makes me, figure that it's important to kind of develop your own checks and balances, and to really like sharpen more reasoning and critical thinking skills in order so that you don't necessarily fall into these particular traps. But I'm going to be very frank with you ladies. I'm still very much so afraid.
It's funny when you say that the intuition, that you can hone it and it gets better and better and better, and then you trust it more and more. I think that can actually be a pitfall. Like, and the only example that comes straight to the top of my head is like, let's say you have a bad run of boyfriends, right? And you're like, okay, men are like X, Y, and Z, right? Or whatever. So you get this intuition that a person who acts a certain way or says a certain thing is always gonna do this certain thing, right? So your intuition starts to fool you into thinking that every single person that fits description A is going to exhibit, behavior B. And I think it makes us overly trust our intuition. So I think it's kind of interesting how we do have like this subconscious intuition that helps us stay out of danger or avoid certain problems. But how often do we take it and consciously misapply it? Like, that would be my question.
Can I talk about intuition?
Yeah.
So, me and Jody are gonna have
Hey Jody, what's up, Miss Whitaker? How you doing? All right.
So that's such a good point, Laura, and it's because we think that our intuitions can be trusted because of outcomes, right? But what enforces our intuitions to us is not the efficacy or truth value of the outcome. It's the emotional reinforcement that results from the outcome. So if we have an intuition that is false, but it results in a positive emotional experience, or at least avoids a negative emotional experience, we will start to develop trust in that intuition as a result of that. Because our intuitions aren't a form of our logical processing centers. They're a form of our emotional processing centers. They're rooted in a part of the brain that is telling us this is scary, or I want to have sex with this. They're not a part of the brain that is trying to figure out whether or not there's, the logic to morality that we can like correctly assess. It's intuitions are grounded in sort of fight, flight, and fucking. that's where intuitions are grounded. So if one of those is reinforced or avoided,
or freeze, Shannon.
Yes, freeze. Yes, that's what I meant. That's what I meant. That is fornication. That's the word I was looking for. That one's an F too. Fight, flight, or fornication. Those are the ones that I meant. So, but that doesn't stop us from incorporating them into the more higher order components of our processing, right? Because we think about the things that we do, and sometimes the things that we do are motivated by emotional reasoning. And then after that motivation from emotional reasoning, we start to process the actual reasons that we're thinking through. So we incorporate the two together, and because we incorporate the two together, that reinforcement starts to get rationalized. And once that reinforcement is rationalized, we start to really have this sort of like strong, like not logical, because it's not logical, but this strong thought process that leads us to believe that I have strong intuitions that I can trust because they lead me to positive outcomes. And that's what leads to this sort of effect so consistently, especially if you start surrounding yourself with people that reinforce your ideals. That will lead you into having a hot ass takes. Hot as fuck takes that are wrong as anyone's ever been wrong.
Are we all thinking about the same person?
You feel real good about them. That's all I had to say.
Actually, like I'm so glad you were getting into that, because that was specifically what I thought of, was that I think not only are social media headlines really dangerous, but I think also sometimes social media followings can be really dangerous, because you get people like Richard Dawkins, cancel me atheists, and Jordan B. Peterson, who develop an entire audience who is reaffirming their assumptions about like trans people, for example, and these really badly thought out arguments that are not borne out in the evidence. And they get their biases reconfirmed, and then they get confrontational about it, you know, on places like Twitter or whatever, because they've already had their bias confirmed so many times. They become overconfident in this like really surface level evaluation of the evidence that they're like dealing with.
Oh my God, Arden.
So great. That's why I was so
Girl.
excited at the start of this when you said go read the articles. There are 3 pillars on my channel: elevate the discourse, be better, not the same, and advocate for your own understanding. Do not take for granted anything that I say, anybody else says here, or anybody says anywhere. Learn some source methodology, figure out systems of logic, do something other than listen to people who seem to have a sphere of influence and think that they're just innately trustworthy, because they could have fallen victim to this. I could be a victim to this right now and have no idea.
Yeah.
Just like anybody else.
Isn't that the intersectionality between, argument from authority and also bandwagon fallacy? Well, everybody, everybody thinks I've been reading yourlogicalfallacyis.com. And I tell you, I learned a lot when I became an atheist. But but back to your point, Arden. I remember I was on a stream yesterday with a conservative, and that was interesting.
That was fun.
Yeah, well, it was. I would love to have that conversation again, but you know why? Because
you're like me. You're a masochist.
I am. I totally am, Shannon. I'm like, yeah, let's do this again.
Do it.
Let's do it. But but one of the things that they said, because I remember we were having like a very we were having discussions specifically about policing in America, and also the disproportionate outcomes that come specifically with African Americans. And I remember that, when I was bringing up some points, because they brought up like, one statistic concerning like, if white people are killed more often in an encounter with police than Black people are, but they qualified that particular stat with even though we're not talking about proportionality.
I was just going to say, what about population percentages?
Exactly.
More of us, of course we are.
And I was just like, sir, but you just said that you just did not mention proportionality to population. Come on now.
Yeah.
So anyway, but one of the things that they said, which was, that came to my mind when you were talking, Arden, was that, well, there's a bunch of people that I know that agree with me. And they were using that as a qualifier, so ergo, I'm right.
Some of them are statisticians, and one of them is this. Yeah, exactly.
Right. And this goes back to my fear. One of the things that, and this is the reason why, like, even in my own, as Shannon and I share, like, this like masochist sensibility concerning having these particular discourses, I think that they're good. But I think that they're good, and the reason being is because like it keeps you, first off, it keeps you on your toes. It keeps you continuously seeking knowledge in order for you to make sure that you're not wrong about certain aspects, and it also helps you not create your own personal echo chamber.
It's a hard row to hoe sometimes when you get like a larger platform too, because then you have to think, am I giving this person a sounding board that they wouldn't have had otherwise? That's when it gets complex, I think, because I would talk to every idiot all the time.
Right. Oh. Honey, have you looked at my Twitter? Anyway.
Going to.
Well, so one problem that I have with the Dunning-Kruger and the idea of, well, it gives you an opportunity to correct yourself and stuff like that, is that so often that's not what happens. Like, so often people aren't called out on their BS, or if they are, they just dismiss it, or say it's on like a test or something and they get it wrong. But they never go back and follow up on that, right? And they never have that chance to really reflect on, oh, I really don't know as much as I think I do. And so I think that it happens a lot where this Dunning-Kruger thing happens, especially in terms of the whole fake news thing, where it's allowed to perpetuate because people aren't getting those challenges that you just mentioned that are so good for us to have the opportunity to change our minds. it's just not happening that way. So I think it is kind of a problem. And one thing that I took away from this, being a mom who homeschools her kids, is how valuable it is to teach my kids how to think, not to teach my kids what to think, and to teach them how to research and how to double check things, not how to read a Google article title or how to here go to this website and read this one article. Like let's get deeper and teach them how to determine whether or not what they think is right or wrong, because it happens all the time with little ones where they're like, nope, I know the answer, and they get all up on their high horse and they're going like just arguing with mommy left and right, and then I prove them wrong, and it's like it happens often. So I think that's the more important thing, is teaching people how to think.
Oh, I love that so much.
I
so great.
second that. I third that emotion because Shannon just spoke, and I'm the third person that just talked. So yes.
So we are going to get ready to move on. But Arden, did you have any final thoughts on this one?
No, I mean, I think it's interesting that the article was mentioning that there are like exercises that people can do to like kind of develop their intuitive reasoning skills. And those are, it'd be interesting to see those things implemented in like school systems in like subtle ways. I think that could be really useful, especially in the age of misinformation. I think kids now more than ever growing up who have tablets in their hands, like from the time they can speak, probably really need those skills more than, we all need those skills. So, but if that's a place we can inject them, then like, great.
Yes, let's do it.
Agreed.
Awesome. So Cynthia, you wanted to introduce our next article.
Sure. And Arden, you actually gave a perfect segue when you were talking about kids and curriculum. So this particular article is entitled Oppose Christian Nationalist Curriculum in Florida Public Schools. This was actually published on April 20th from the American Atheist. And so basically this, just to give a summation of this article, it's talking about how the Florida Department of Education is trying to implement or move forward with curriculum standards that would actually, bring in would actually indoctrinate students into false Christian nationalist versions of history, which is scary. A couple of things that I highlighted, even like from this article that they brought out, was like, a couple of standards that they were talking about, which would include seventh graders to recognize how Judeo-Christian values influence America's founding ideals and documents. And students will be required to learn about the Ten Commandments and the Protestant work ethic. I don't know what a Protestant work ethic is, but okay.
It's whatever work ethic a Protestant says is a Protestant.
Right. Yes. And yes.
And
Shannon, yes, I'm feeling it. Yes, work. And and also various supposedly Judeo-Christian values. Another one that they pointed out, which was like really like I was tripping on, was they would require ninth graders to analyze the influence of Judeo-Christian values on America's founding ideals and documents. Specifically, students would be taught that core principles of American governance, such as limited government and separation of powers, are actually Judeo-Christian values. And basically that they're just trying to espouse propaganda in public schools, in public schools. I want to say that again. They're trying to actually, utilize a propaganda technique in public schools that we actually pay into with taxes. They are doing this, and it's oh my gosh. Okay, I'm going to shut up and let y'all talk.
Because I think we're all suffering from the same sort of shock that you're suffering from. Like the notes that I wrote on this one were literally, I wrote this. The first thing I thought is, well, this is not surprising. And then the second is, how are we still having this argument at this day and age? Right? Like it should seem so freaking obvious by now, the difference between a religious teaching and a historical teaching and where to draw the line. And the fact that it's that clear it is literally Judeo-Christian, and 10 Commandments are written into the legislation itself. It's mind-boggling.
Yeah. I think I also, like, I'm really bothered by the use of Judeo-Christian, because usually Judeo-Christian it reeks of this like anti-Semitic, the Jewish question kind of vibes of like,
At the very least, it's
contradicting.
appropriation.
Yeah, I think very rarely when people are talking about Judeo-Christian values are they advocating for the implementation of Jewish like holidays and practices in schools. They're advocating specifically for, things like the Protestant work ethic, whatever that is, and specifically Christian beliefs. I think it's their way of trying to appeal to broad religious freedom without being revealed to be purely Christian nationalists.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that even like the article even pointed out that I don't know if it was this one or the other one, but a concern like if they actually utilize this particular a language concerning like Islamic a teaching to be actually put into schools, it would be considered a problem. So so like it's kind of like, where would you actually draw the line as far as like in inserting a certain religious doctrine again in public schools? And
It seems to go
even
to,
to
like, sorry, go ahead.
oh no, I was just even going to say, like, even to your point, like when I hear like oftentimes Judeo-Christian values, that's a trigger for me as well, because like oftentimes Judeo-Christian values meant biases, prejudiced, and some type of ism that was actually espoused to other marginalized groups.
But
I just want to put that out there. Go ahead.
But what it means today, like when you say Judeo-Christian values or Christian values, is whatever the values of that society are today.
Sure.
Like it almost has no meaning, right? Other than where maybe it's still a bit separated from society. But they'll even say things like anti-slavery is a Christian value, even though slavery is clearly in the Bible. And then we have to have that argument over and over and over again, and it never dies.
And
So
I don't mind having that argument, but go ahead.
I don't think it's that innocuous, though. Like when they say Judeo-Christian values, they mean whatever our values are currently as the
At the
majority
moment.
of Christians.
Yes.
Yeah.
So just because we can look at them and say, okay, well, obviously you guys aren't going to be holding slaves now because we won't let you, for starters, and
Right.
like you know what I mean? Just because you're willing to like sort of acknowledge things that should go without saying in the current society, that doesn't mean that Judeo-Christian values doesn't mean a certain kind of something. Because they sure are trying to pass anti-trans legislation all over the place, everywhere they can. That's also affecting women. I'm an athlete. I am a cisgender female athlete, and if I had gone to school in some states in the United States and these bills passes, I would have had to have my genitals inspected, because Christians are enforcing their Judeo-Christian values, which may sometimes overlap with societal values, but also are utilized because they're the majority to enforce whatever they feel like their values are and legislate them, which is what they're doing here. So I'm hesitant to allow them to be that innocuous because they are so goddamn dangerous.
Oh, absolutely. No, I fully agree with you. I also think it's a form of, when you say Christian nationalism, just to be clear for what we're saying to everybody, or at least what I take away from it, is we are teaching children in public schools that Christianity has a very specific impact on our history that history doesn't support that it actually has. So we're brainwashing children to think the founding of our country is based on this or that principle or value, when there's just absolutely no basis for it, rather than teaching the kids to think, let's look into our history and let's analyze all the different factors and analyze all the different cultural and historical things that happened. You're giving them one narrow narrative, and you're
it's
making them buy
prioritizing
that
Christianity as the people who form society.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
And ignoring every other influence and ignoring the things that Christianity did that were a detriment to society simultaneously.
Yeah.
And also just having like another form of really their own version of history. You know, I mean, like, even if we're going back to that one of those particular principles about, Judeo-Christian values influencing government, American governance, including separation of powers, and what is it that they also did? Some other shit. Anyway, but it's as far as like American governance, like limited government and also separation of powers, calling that like Judeo-Christians. That's like a Judeo-Christian values that actually influence that. That's actually quite false. That's very false. Like, I mean, like the where we even got the notions of like coming up with a democratic system actually came from Greece. That was like like a Greek how they actually set up their particular society for government. And last time I checked, ancient Greek was polytheistic. Just saying. Shout out to Zeus.
Yeah.
Shout out to Zeus.
Word.
What's interesting too is how, in order to, I love the bait and switch sometimes that people use that people seem to buy into this, is that they're essentially saying that schools are currently teaching propaganda, so they have to teach this instead. So they've convinced people that actual history is propaganda so that they can replace actual history with propaganda. Seamlessly. Mm-hmm. And people buy into it. And that's what blows my mind, because they believe so much in the truth of the proposition of Christianity. And they've bought so much into this misrepresentation that Christianity itself is under attack and people aren't even going to be allowed to have faith, that the pendulum swings so far in the opposite direction that people are now hyper vigilant in order to preserve it because they feel as though it's under threat. And then that's when these types of things happen. Mm-hmm. And I just wish more people could recognize that they're being manipulated that way, because like they're going to tear down society.
Right. And then last time I checked, Christians are not being tortured in America. Stop.
Yeah, no shit, right?
Please.
Last
you guys are fine.
What? That had me.
Okay, so we're talking about this article that includes legislation in Florida. And so before we get too far into it, I kind of wanted to blend the next article that we have, because we're going to end up running short on time, which is legislation in Arkansas. And see if we can kind of blend those two discussions together, because both are talking about the same thing. They're both talking about inserting specifically Christian teaching into public school curriculum. So just really quickly, I'm going to run by that article really quick, and then we can get back to this discussion, but expand it not just from the prospect of American history or perspective of American history, but also the perspective of science and creationism. So really quickly, the last article that we have that is very pertinent to this conversation is titled "Unconstitutional Arkansas Creationism Bill Dies After Freedom from Religion Foundation Announces Plan to Sue." And so what this bill is a bill that would include the teaching for, like, the required inclusion of creationism in the science teaching of public schools in Arkansas. And it passed the House of Representatives, and it was into the Senate, and it didn't pass in the Senate by a 3-3 vote, so there was a tie. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's dead, right? It just means that it's halted for the moment. So what do you ladies think about including the conversation of creationism into this conversation of how we teach American history?
I think the thing that scares me the most about this bill, and I think it was noted in the article, I'm not sure who the author was. The article was from FFRF, I believe. Mm-hmm. That was saying that they suspect that Representative Bentley, who I don't know if she authored the bill but it seems like she was speaking on it, that she was motivated by the shift in the Supreme Court that happened kind of against what's considered, the normal practice at the end of Trump's term of like inserting a new Supreme Court justice at the end of an election year. And like that's really terrifying to me, that these people might be like explicitly seeing that they can subvert the Constitution and are like just going for the throat on that. That's really that's clearly what they've been doing with the anti-trans legislation that's been going on that passed in Arkansas. Mm-hmm. That's really terrifying, and it's hard to know how or when or if we could ever really pump the brakes on that, because the fact is, Bentley is right. The Supreme Court is different, and they are seeming to get away with a lot more bullshit all of a sudden. So, like, I don't know, that instills a lot of fear in me that I don't really feel like I have a clear understanding of what the solutions are sometimes.
It is scary. I mean, like, even if you just think about like the whole court packing that actually happened under the Trump era, and I would argue with anybody that, like, even though that we are a government that is supposed to have like different branches of different branches, that the that's supposed to have checks and balances, the Supreme Court has a lot of power. And remember, those are lifetime appointments, and they can actually set a narrative for generations when it comes to how to interpret law. And if you have Supreme Court justices that have a tendency to be a bit more right in their thinking and right in their interpretation of laws, imagine how that can affect an entire group of people, oftentimes adversely. And even though, like, the Supreme Court has, sometimes shown some glimmers, I would even say during even when Trump's appointees, when it came to, like, certain legislation that came in front of them, um, it's still very much so this kind of ideology that rules it. And even to your point, Arden, that's very, to me, that's very problematic. It's very scary. I even think about it, even how, like, how it even, like, was used, like, when we were looking, like, at the voter rights laws, and even how Georgia was able to, like, pass, like, all these particular voter suppression laws recently, and we still don't necessarily have, like, a full um, a full, like, workup to actually find out if these particular voters suppression laws are even constitutional. But there's a possibility that because the court is so right leaning, that they would actually uphold it, substantiate it, allow it to be. And I almost, like, feel like no, actually, I don't feel like it, because it was an article that, yes, like, this representative said that, hey, because we do have a court systems that have been packed, specifically by Republicans, and in this particular administration, that we can go ahead and shoehorn everything that we want to get done, including, teach non-science to children and call it, but God said, and therefore it's okay. And that is scary. That's problematic. That makes me cringe. And, I need melatonin now. So continue.
Yeah, I don't know. I think that both these articles show that there is a call to action needed, right? Like, what can we do to stop this from happening? Obviously, the Freedom from Religion Foundation is fighting their asses off on all of these different cases, and they're continuing to make a lot of progress and halt a lot of stuff. A lot of stuff is still happening. This one barely didn't make it. Like, it was a 3-3 vote. It was a tie. So it barely was halted. And that doesn't mean it can't be put forward again, or that it can't get through the next time. So what I think of when I read these articles is that we, as secular communities, not just atheist communities, but secular, humanist, whatever it is, need to get more involved in our legislation and more involved in our public school system, and knowing what our public school system is being told that they need to teach. Because a lot of times, not even the parents of these students know what the standards are for each grade level and for each subject. It's send your kid to school, hope they get an education, check in on their grades, and hope for the best, right? I'm not saying that all parents are crappy or bad, but we're overwhelmed, right? And so I think it's important for us to really get involved and figure out how we can get in touch with the right people to be more active in what our public schools are not just allowed to teach, but are being forced to teach by these standards.
And even to your point, Laura, I would echo it and raise it with just because you don't have children doesn't necessarily mean that your voice can't be heard. I mean, true. Like, what, and I think that, like, oftentimes, like, us that may not necessarily have kids may actually, develop some apathy when it comes to curriculums that are being proposed to children. But, we shouldn't. We really shouldn't. And the reason being is because we should care about what the future society looks like, what they're being taught, and how they're being taught. Yeah.
And how that's going to impact us down the line. Yeah,
Correct.
absolutely. So with these in mind, are there any other final thoughts on the legislation or either of these bills? What are your ladies' final thoughts on this?
I'll come take you all to Canada with me.
I know you were awful quiet on this one, like with the psychology ones, you had so much to say. I know.
It's not a thing I encounter at all.
Perfect. So I want to know, from your perspective, just north of us, when you look at what is going on here, what are some of your thoughts? Like, what do
if
you?
anybody tried that here, there'd be a riot. Like the
As there
parents
should
would
be.
lose their minds. Like, you're not preparing our kids for university. They need a diverse education so that they can apply to go wherever they want. We have a say in forming the curriculum. Not all of us believe the same religion, and even those of us who do believe the same religion don't believe the same version of it. It has no place in here. You are talking to a member of the country that literally removed the word God from our national anthem because we were like, we're not indoctrinating our children.
I love that.
That's
so
awesome.
how do we get to where you're at? Yeah. So we don't have time in the rest of this show to say how do we get there, but that's a question I'm going to leave us all with is how do we get there?
Yeah. Beautiful here. You'll love it. I mean, it's not all sunshine and roses. We got our shit, but I mean, it's not that shit. Like, I couldn't even imagine. That's like
I have a running joke or stand with Neil, the 604 to get my cot ready. Because I'm on my way, and Shannon, I'm going to have to put that out to you as well. If you got a spare bedroom, I'll pay rent. I'm just saying.
You got a cot on either side of the country ready for you because he's on the opposite side. I'm in Nova Scotia. He's over in BC.
No problem.
We have both coasts covered now.
Nice. So Shannon's final thoughts are come to Canada, and Cynthia's final thoughts are I'm on my way. Arden, what are your final thoughts as we close this show up?
It's just. This kind of stuff, I think, I don't think these people are doing it intentionally, but I suspect that part of the motivation is like an intention to exhaust the opposition. Because when you have, 30 plus bills across, or, 100 bills across 30 states or whatever that are targeting trans legislation, and they're trying to inject religion into school in all these different states, there's like no conceivable way that any individual activist or organization can confront every single one of these in every single way possible. And it's just, I think it's disgusting and it should be represented as disgusting. So those are my thoughts.
That's
it's
really
like a blitzkrieg.
Yeah.
All right. So Cynthia, final thoughts. Yeah.
Yes. Christians, hear me. Lend me your ears. Stop it. Just plain fucking stop it. You keep doing this. Just stop it. That's all I got to say.
Yeah. Live and let live. For fuck's sake.
For fun's sake.
I don't even know if we're allowed to say that on this show.
No, we can.
I'm here. We swear now.
Yeah. Oh, the first time that I ever was on this show, I think that I was the first one to drop the F-bomb. So.
Oh, were you?
I think that's a perfect way to wrap the show off. Yeah. I think we're gonna end it on the F-bomb. So, ladies, it was incredibly fun to talk to you, and I hope we get to either individually or all at once again. I hope we get to be together again.
Indeed.
This is great.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much.
Do we have any
it says
show notes to swing out on?
Okay, so let's rehash everything that we went over today because we've got 2 minutes left. And so let's think about, so we went over Beth Moore, progress, right? At least a little progress. And then we went over the psychological, whether or not we can sense spirituality. So I think we're getting there in terms of research, faulty as it is. Not so much getting there on legislation. So what do you ladies think overall for all these different things? Are we making progress? Are we making steps backwards? Are we still fighting a fight? What do you guys think?
We're still fighting. And and as long as like I have coffee, I'm going to keep on fighting. So, and I hope that you all too will as well. I think that this would, just mean that we need to be more involved, and we need to continuously push for for people that we know and that's around us, to employ critical thinking skills, and also very much so get involved in the political process so that we can make sure that like these problematic legislations that affect us all, stop it.
Okay.
Yeah.
And we're going to end on that note. I think that's a lovely note to end on.
Bye.
All right. So, yeah, time to say goodbye. Thank you all.